GM friends, and welcome to the Future of Gaming. You are listening to our weekly FOGcast. Today it is Phil and I, and we have a special guest, Philip Law. Philip is a prolific person in the Web3 gaming space. He has spent time before Web3 at Pokemon Go and Facebook, then joined Axie Infinity and is currently the director of product at Roboto Games. The reason we're speaking with Phil is because he's generally a very well-informed and well-opinionated person about the intersection of blockchain and games, so it's always a pleasure to talk to him. But he recently brought out a piece where he thought himself to be a school teacher and is like, I'm going to grade Web3 and what it brings to games. And so he wrote a piece where you looked at all of the different things that Web3 does for gaming, and you essentially gave it a grade from A to F, which as an European I find really annoying. Just do like 1 to 10, man. It's really not that hard. Anyway, one more thing about this podcast is going to be confusing because we have two Philips here, and we'll figure it out. Like I'll try and make sure that you guys know who I'm addressing, so we don't have these awkward moments where it's like, did he ask that to me? Anyway, Philip La, sir, welcome to the show. Thank you for being here. I would say,
Thanks
feel free to tell us a bit more about why you decided to write this piece, a bit about your methodology, and then we can dig in.
Yeah, so after the crazy year and a half at Sky Mavis, learned a lot. It was really fun experience, challenging as well, and I just had all these learnings and thoughts around Web3 and gaming, and areas where I saw it was very valuable and areas where I felt it was overstated. And I had a little bit of a break between the two companies, and I wanted to share it. I was like, I think there's some things that could be helpful to other developers, other people making Web3 games. And so, decided to share it. And this is, a lot of it is based on the current state of Web3 and where it is now. And, it's hard to predict the future. So I'm sure there'll be different challenges and, different things that get a lot better too over time. But this is just looking at some of the current state of it and where it's really advantageous and where it falls short. And so my whole grading system is very much based on the incremental value that I see Web3 bringing to games. And that incorporates a couple components, which are not just for each of these topics that I go over, not just the incremental value that Web3 provides to this topic, but also, how important is this topic? Things like, provable scarcity. Sure, Web3 makes it so you can really prove if something is scarce and how scarce it is, but do people really care about that? So that's a big component of kind of how I graded things as well. So my North American bias definitely pushed me to do the A to F, and I think we'll work with that.
Good. Yeah, I think it makes sense. A is good, F is really bad, right?
Yep.
Should we go maybe bottom to top? Like, I have general thoughts about the approach that I'd love to discuss, but maybe let's just go through so listeners can also, that haven't read the piece, which, by the way, obviously will be linked down below. So let's go through maybe we don't need to go through all of them because there's quite a few, but let's talk about maybe the ones that where you don't see Web3 adding any value at all.
I don't think there's any of them where I don't see Web3 adding any value at all. I think there's ones that I think are much, much less. And I think, a lot of it comes down to it depends. I think there's some of them where I have a low grade that I think could be extremely valuable to a particular product or company. But in the aggregate, I'm seeing it as, less impactful. So you mentioned want to start from the bottom. So that's what, user acquisition and community building? Yeah. All right. So with that one,
oh, sorry, Phil. No. What I meant was the bottom, as in the least impact or the least beneficial.
Oh, least.
That's
impact.
What I meant. So imagine we have a class with very smart students like Philip Collins here, and you as well. And then you have the D tier. That's me. Sitting in the back of the class, asking stupid questions, not understanding what's going on. Okay. So let's start with the bad students. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. So, one of the first ones was marketplaces and trading, right near the top of the post. I think this one's very overstated. A lot of, Web3, I think, enthusiasts and, people supporting the ecosystem say, Web3 unlocks marketplaces and trading, and now you can trade all your assets and do all these, crazy DeFi things or whatnot with them as well. So there's actually two things there. So that I've split into one to real money gameplay and one is marketplaces and trading. And so when I talk about marketplaces and trading, I'm specifically talking about just exchange of in-game assets. And to me, that's been done in Web 2. It's been done in many different ways in Web 2 as well. From people having to barter goods in World of Warcraft to having full auction houses in games like Albion Online and many others. And they work. People are able to exchange goods, and I don't see, that much value in, having all of that activity in Web3. And actually, there's disadvantages because a lot of times in Web3, you have to go the full, basically auction house, exchange system. You can't have these more interesting gameplay systems where people actually have to find each other and socialize and, have interesting interactions to trade. And so we actually saw that in one of the Axie Infinity games with Homeland. So we wanted to implement this trading feature in Axie Infinity Homeland that actually matters where your land is placed. And if we just made the trading all on chain, then people would just go on exchange and trade things. But because we put trading of these particular items in a way where, if you trade with your neighbor, it's super fast. If you trade with someone super far away, it's slow. And you can't do those types of things if everything's on chain. So that's why I think, from a pure trading perspective, Web3 is, relatively low and weak.
I think that's fair. I'm going to, in doing this, try and be the advocate of the devil sometimes and try to steel man, the case of Web3. But to me, the way I'm thinking about this, and again, it's important to mention that your whole premise was that you're looking at how the technology works today and not necessarily like how it could become in the future, right? But even keeping that in mind, I think one of the benefits here, and I'd love to get your thoughts on that, is essentially trading is like one financial primitive that has been built on top of the blockchain, and it is the ability to exchange from one person to the next. But another example of a financial primitive would be lending. Another financial primitive would be fractionalization. And so to me, as the advocate of the devil here, there are, as a developer, if like I'm a game developer, you have, once you use the blockchain, in the box, it's all in there, right? And all of the tooling that exists around the financialization of assets is there, and it might make a lot of things easier that you don't have to build it in-house yourself.
Yeah. So I think the kind of existing systems argument makes a lot of sense. I think there's a reason why theoretically you can have these tools all built in Web 2 as tools that developers can use to, Unity can build out a trading system and lending and all of this for gamers to use, game developers to use. And there's a reason why it just hasn't been built out. It's because people haven't particularly felt it was valuable to their game mechanics and their particular game to have these, or else, all of those things, assuming it's not involving real money, can be built through Web 2 and through platforms that provide engines and services. So I do see that, right now, a lot of those exist more so in Web 3 than, in Web 2 tools. But I don't know if that's a matter of, the actual usefulness and necessity of them.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point because especially with the current state of Web3, the hurdle for adoption is, does this give me something net new? And I feel like that's where your grades, which are kind of listed as Web3 value grading, marketplaces and trading would fall lower on my list as well, because we've seen examples where different variations of this can be done. And I do think there are certain advantages when done right to the player for having this more free and open market with multiple different channels for buying and selling goods. But to your point, there are historical precedents for similar functionality. And just with the temperature of this space, how much incremental value does it actually unlock, or how many new features and capabilities does it unlock? I think this is where Web3 is a little bit more of a minor leap for both developers and players, even if there is value, which is, I think, why it's not an F here. I think it's lower compared to other features that we can talk about.
Awesome. Good. Let's go to the next one. And Philip, I'll leave it to you to perhaps skip ones that you think are slightly less interesting, or skip towards ones that you think or that you really want to talk about.
Cool. Yeah, so let's... Yeah, I guess we're still working through the lower ones, and then we'll go from pessimistic to more optimistic, because a lot of things I still obviously really believe in and love about the Web3 gaming side. Yeah, we could talk about a very so there's interoperability and user acquisition. I think both those are super interesting. Let's start with user acquisition and community building. So I was just thinking a lot about, okay, how much value does Web3 bring, but also detract from UA right now? And I think initially we were seeing, during the upswing of Web3 in the market, that there was just a huge appetite. You put out a token, you put out your Web3 game, and people flock into your Discord, and you get a bunch of initial players, which is really hard, especially for indie games, especially for people who don't have a big brand, people who haven't made games before. So that was a big advantage, which has obviously tapered off a bit now. But there's also a lot of the disadvantages with obviously not having distribution platforms easily accessible, like Steam, like Apple, like Google, on mobile. So that's kind of the high level of the UI. I think there is still appetite and value for these types of mints and airdrops, and we've still seen some of these free mints, go pretty viral and pick up some steam. But that's also, for a particular audience, right? Which is for the existing Web3 audience, not necessarily pulling new people into the space. So that's why I have it as a lower grading. I think it's C. C was my grading, and I gave it a plus because I think having that ability to bring in an initial audience still is still very valuable, because having that, just a bunch of people in your Discord makes it much easier to bring someone in, and there's people who will explain the game to them, who will talk about it, who will evangelize it. So I think there still is value there, but in terms of the larger distribution, getting it to millions and millions of players, it's not adding as much right now, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I think there's a maturity aspect of that, because the keyword that I think of when it comes to Web3 UA is really on the targeting front. And outside of Web3 games, we've seen how difficult targeting new players has become, right? UA and marketing and advertising is kind of a mess right now. And Web3 does give you the transparency you need to find players and use actual data and proven demonstrations of interest to find the right people. I think to your point today, one of the problems is a relatively small but growing number of game developers are targeting a very small number of players. And so there's all this overlap where, even if you know the right type of player, it's hard to actually get their attention. And so if Web3 adoption on the consumer side reaches critical mass and you have, tens of millions of players or hundreds of millions of players to reach, I think that's where this targeting becomes extremely effective. But this is almost contingent on that user adoption of Web3, which is kind of solved by other factors.
Yeah, and I think the part that I also missed was just that there is some power in being able to drop these assets with real money value to people to try out your game, right? Because they're like, all right, I get $10, $50, hundreds of dollars of this NFT, and someone just gave it to me. Yeah, sure, I'll play the game and I'll start advocating for it. But that has a lot of strings attached with how people view the game, how they look at it as more of an investment, or how they see it, look for ROI and things like that. So that has a larger effect on the culture. So something to be just super careful about.
So if I was asked to give a grading on this part, is like I would even give it a lower grading, probably a D, or maybe even a D minus. I don't know. Do you work with minuses? Do I see a minus?
Yeah. We have
so
minuses.
we can do minuses. All right, to just make it a bit more complex. Thank you.
Yeah.
Anyway, as if you listen to this, you know that I'm very cynical, and that's probably because I hang out in the wrong Twitter areas or whatever. But to me, it seems like 90+% of the people that are into Web3 games are just here to speculate. And so on a purely community basis, choosing to go Web3 today, essentially, as you said, right, it gives you maybe like a 500 to 1,000 easy users, but it limits your growth significantly because there's a lot of platforms that you can't use to start targeting users, and you can't be on the app stores, or if you do, you have to go through like a ton of hoops. And so for that reason, I think that I would say for the community and the user acquisition building, like Web3 is probably the worst thing you can do today. And so that's the community that you then build, if you decide to do it, I think is not, like, I see them as having a negative LTV, which is something that I feel like we should probably have a discussion about someday, because it's probably the first time I've expressed that opinion. But for me, they're like net extractors of value of the game. And in the end, every game is a business, and you need value created, and you need some money to flow into the game at some point. And so you need positive LTV players. And to me, the golden or the first cohorts of the Web3 users won't be that.
And it's kind of problematic today too, where the user acquisition cycle in the Web3 space over the last 2 years feels like it started so much earlier in the process of actually launching and building out a game, where you're now trying to basically turn a lot of these players into quote-unquote owners, whether through tokens or NFTs and airdrops, where you want them to come to your game 6, 12, 18 months before the game is out. And so the UA cycle has been kind of illogical up to this point. And so you end up with those financially motivated, hopefully eventually players, but at the end of the day, it's not traditional UA where a game launches and the game is out and you can come play it and determine if it's a good product. You're getting acquired when you have no idea what you're getting acquired into.
Yeah, I think there was basically this hypothesis where game developers felt that they can bring in these players, with these kind of monetary incentives, basically, and then cross their fingers and hope, they're going to convert to just love the game and spend for fun and all those things. And it's really hard to really bridge that, to get people to switch that mindset of like, I came here for, financialization, and now like the game is so good, I just want to play and spend money and put all my money into it without any, expectations of ROI and things like that.
Yeah, it's like there's a sunk cost element. It's like, oh, I've already put so much money into this. I've already bought these assets, so I might as well try to force myself to enjoy the game. You're getting buy-in. You're getting buy-in in a way that is counter to most games, where maybe a pre-order is the equivalent in traditional gaming, but that feels very different from the cycles and approaches we've seen in Web3.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Does this tie in with one of the other points, Phil, around perhaps crowdfunding? So one thing that I think Web3 does pretty well, or like Web3 does pretty well, that sounds weird, is just giving your players an asset or a part of the game that has real world value. It becomes interesting that they do have skin in the game, and they're more likely than players that don't have skin in the game to share things, to create things, to try to convince their friends to play, etc. Which one of the points is do you talk about there?
Yeah. Crowdfunding is definitely related. I think it's all framing, right? So, you have platforms like Kickstarter and Indiegogo that already exist, and people crowdfund tons of games on those platforms. And when people put money into it, it's not with the expectation that they're getting money out. They want this game to exist, right? They want some perks, some benefits, maybe some in-game bonuses, things like that. And so getting a asset before you get the game, I think is net positive for crowdfunding campaigns that are have this type of expectation and have this type of narrative. So now I want this game to exist, so I put money into it, but I also get this digital asset that I get to own until it comes out. But as long as it's maintained that this is not something that you're just getting so you can sell or you can flip and you can make money off of, because for the most part you're not going to. And I think that's the main thing, is that it's fine for all these things to have real money value. I have tons of collectibles and things that have that, but that's not the primary driver within the market and within that ecosystem for those assets. So I think crowdfunding can really benefit from it, as long as it's continued to be positioned in the right way.
Agreed. Bold prediction here, or spicy take here, for me.
Mm-hmm.
I think that Web3 enabled gaming assets will go down, specifically NFTs, will go down in history as probably one of the worst asset classes to, that people have ever truly invested in and believed in. Probably close to tulips in the Netherlands in the 17th century.
I was thinking the exact same thing. Tulips are the comp here.
Yeah. Good.
Yeah, I think it's going to be few and far between. Most assets are going to go to zero, and there's going to be some that take off, and that for those people, maybe they'll say here's the proof, but no one should expect that. And I think if that does happen with certain assets, that the game has to take off, right? So it goes back to you have to have a really good game to start. And maybe if there's a game that takes off, then the assets that people collect and people really care about will take off as well.
And the hard thing with the crowdfunding thing is not everyone should be a VC, right? And that's not because they can't think through it or process through it. It's that when you're a VC, you have LPs that have large diversified portfolios, and these high-risk assets make sense for them. But for the average individual, taking venture-style bets on individual pieces of content is just not for everyone. And that's not a bad thing. It's just fundamentally not good for a lot of individuals for their situations. And so to need to take on that amount of risk to get into a video game, I think is a uncommon and has been a bit of a negative thing for a lot of people. And there's probably a lot of people that have acted irresponsibly because they see the upside, but it's just a model that's not for everyone as a individual.
Yeah, and that's one part I don't dig that much into in my post, is just all the regulations and things that will change probably in the next few years around buying these assets and putting it into tokens or NFTs, because in a lot of ways, there's a reason why people can't just buy stocks of private companies, and they got to be accredited investors to put in a certain amount of money, and there's all these regulations around it to protect your average consumer. So I think there'll be more of that over time.
Yeah, agreed. All right, next point, Phil.
On to the next. I think interoperability is a good one to go over. I gave it a lower score, although it is one that I do get excited about. But being in the games industry for a while now, and feeling the very restrictive pressures of IPs, I just think it's very hard if people think I'm gonna take this skin from Fortnite and use it in CSGO, and that type of interoperability I think is very far off and very difficult. So I don't see Web3 adding any value to do that type of thing. I think for the newer generation, we're seeing glimmers of this. I mentioned one of them with Nifty Island, who's bringing in a bunch of different Web3 projects, and because there is that culture within Web3 projects to just let their assets be used in other projects, I think if they gain more mainstream adoption and become larger mainstream brands, there is that opportunity to have really interesting interoperability plays. But for now, I'm still seeing it's pretty difficult given all the restrictions. And I'm hopeful that these new Web3 brands will be able to continue to allow their assets to be used in other games. But who knows? Like in the future, they might decide our brand is actually so awesome, we want to start having licensing fees and we want to protect it more, and we end up back where we are. So that's why it's really hard for me to predict where this is going to go, and that's why I gave it a lower score to start, but with kind of some opportunity. I think one other area that I don't know if it's really interoperability, but has potential is this idea of just being able to see the assets people own and giving them some value in another game, right? Which is what some of these products, I mentioned Million on Mars somewhere here, they will let people say, if you own a Bored Ape, you get this quest experience in our game and things like that. So it's not directly using the IP or assets, but giving them benefits for it. So yeah, that's kind of my take on interop.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a fair take. I sometimes get frustrated when I hear people that have decades of experience in the gaming space dismiss the concept of interoperability by saying that it's impossible to, take a gun from, let's say, Counter-Strike and take it to Call of Duty. Mm-hmm. And that is such a terrible argument and such a narrow take on the concept of interoperability. And so, you mentioned skins and avatars, and I think those are probably like the how should I describe it? Maybe the first step of what we know today and how this can be translated into true, like, interoperable assets within a Web3 enabled universe of games. But my take here is that I think we'll see more interoperability than pretty much anyone expects, but just not in the way that we think, where it's like literally asset A, and I'm going to take asset A, and it's going to be asset A in game, in another game, right? It's going to be, smartly designed. It's going to be maybe bottom up in a sort of loot approach, or it's going to be, it's going to be like items that don't have a inherent visual or tangible characteristic, but then that do have effects on your gaming experience within different games and universes, and there's infinite ways how that can work. And so, yeah, anyway, my take is don't strawman this by saying, in today's AAA games that will never work. But again, your grading, I would say, is correct because you're looking at today. So that's why C plus. That's I can see that.
Yeah, I also feel like we've seen a lot of platforms try to create their own identity around interoperability, where they're creating their own suite of games, and one of their big hooks is, if you buy an asset in our ecosystem, it works across all of our games natively because they're our games, and we've built them that way. I don't think of interoperability as like a compelling UA feature where I want to go play those games because I can use my assets there. I think that if you're going to think about it in UA, what Philip mentioned before of, you own a Bored Ape and you can take that asset into Million on Mars. And it's almost like, hey, we know there's this big, massive channel of people that are looking for things to do with these items. Let's give them something to do. And it's not necessarily direct dollars into our pockets because, they were still purchased outside of our platform, but because you have that, you can come get some benefits over here, so you might want to give it a try, and hopefully that turns you into a retained sticky user that then decides to spend money on Million on Mars assets. And it's always been difficult because interoperability, based on what we've seen from startups, feels much more like a business problem than a technical problem, right? I think over time, the technical solutions will be there. And I don't know if that's 12 months, 3 years, 5 years, until it is done very well. But with the amount of smart people working on it, I have faith that it will be possible. But there's also an element of, who does this benefit the most? And is it the big players that want their assets to be everywhere, that already have really strong IP? Or is it more of the smaller indie-style devs that want to attract new players because they promise this great feature of interoperability? And I think this will continue to evolve, but just saying, oh, we're going to be able to use our Call of Duty weapons in another game, it's like, what motivation does Call of Duty have to share revenue with another game? And in that case, what value does the other game really have from pulling in these assets? I think there's a question of value accrual that becomes really, really important here, and I think that's ultimately what will dictate who is willing to experiment here, and which is why it might take a little bit longer than we're hoping, because I think there's a lot of room for incentive misalignment with interoperability that we sometimes understate.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think, as a game with millions and millions of users, like, why do you want to drive some of those users to another platform or another game, and what is the benefits you're getting? And I think those need to be clear for people to allow it, especially at a larger scale. But yeah, I think the tech, as you mentioned, is there, and will develop. I think the really, like, the fundamental value for interop is just that you can very easily attribute an asset to any particular wallet or person. So anyone can just look on chain. This person owns this asset, and so I can give them an experience or let them use that asset somewhere else. And that's what doesn't exist in Web2 right now. You got to build APIs, you got to make connections, all that type of stuff. And yeah, that's why it makes it really easy within the same IP, as you mentioned. For Axie Infinity, we had the same Axie can be used in 3, 4, 5, 6 games, and so that was pretty powerful because you can keep creating more and more value with that same asset quite easily without having to build out those APIs and make sure they can, function and be attributed to players in all those different games. And yeah, I think on your point on, who's really benefiting, vampire attacks are obviously a thing within the space. And I think, that's something that might actually make certain players less likely to go on chain, because now you can identify and target their players, and give them benefits and try to lure them away. So I think there's benefits and disadvantages with that mechanic.
Yep, agreed. Can we talk about ownership permanence, or can you talk about ownership permanence? Because I think this is one that's I'm just interested in talking about and get you guys' thoughts on.
Yeah. So for ownership permanence, kind of what I refer to this as is just the idea that you can own a digital asset because it's on chain. There is this different sense and level of permanence that as long as there's some number of people decentralizing this chain, it'll exist forever, regardless of a company or a single entity or a single individual. This object will always exist and be attached to you. And I think this is beneficial as a whole for players to be able to own their assets from games in this way. I think it's probably less appreciated in the short term because you're like, oh, I have this asset. But in the long term, I feel like 10 years from now, when you're like, oh, I still own this item from this game I played 10 years ago, it feels great. That's how I feel about a lot of my collectibles from when I was a kid. I didn't care as much about them and just like owning them back then, but now I have them all displayed in my display case, and I feel really glad that I still have them and I still own them. So I think that's something that will be appreciated more in the long term too. But obviously there's a lot of nuances with digital compared to physical. A lot of NFTs right now, for example, art pointers are pointing to a JPEG or a GIF or GIF, whatever you want to call it, in a database, and so theoretically it may not exist forever if it's just a pointer and the asset is not on chain or not decentralized. So I think there's some areas there, and and then there's another argument that I have, and it's just like, how much do people care about this? Which is actually why I have it lower than being an A and A plus or whatnot. It's some people just play their game and then they leave it, and then it's fine. I don't really care about owning those assets forever. I'm more of a collector, so I might be biased. Like, I love holding on to things and hoarding things, but not everyone cares about that.
Yeah, this is one that I would probably give a lower grade, just given the fact that the permanence of assets, as we think about NFTs and token IDs, I don't think is going to be correlated to an increase in the number of forever games that there are out there, right? Where there's 5, 10 plus year runs where these games remain relevant. Because I don't think that's driven by the asset level. And so for a lot of these games, even though the collectible will be permanent, I do think that the use case for many of these will eventually be very fleeting, where after a couple of years, if the game's not doing that well, the servers just get shut off, and then you still own it in your wallet, but that digital use case is gone. And maybe there's some interesting comps in physical collectibles, but I feel like when I think of physical collectibles, a lot of the value is in them being tangible and kind of in your real world. And so I don't know if digital assets are going to hold the same kind of value when their use case is gone. Because for a lot of physical collectibles, I feel like the use case is almost for the sake of collecting them. Whereas these digital assets for games, there's an actual tangible use case for them. And when that's gone, does the value of your emotional connection also go with the game? So that's something that I think is a little bit different here. But I think sometimes we also like to forget that games do in fact shut down and servers go off. And there's so many great examples of that not happening that it's easy to forget about the long tail that it does happen to.
Mm-hmm. Can we also... well, Phil, I want to ask you, did you consider, or where did you consider the ability of players to resell their game assets? And this could be things that they purchased in games, which could be skins or anything else. Where does that fit within your framework?
So I have that basically in, I think, real money gameplay, where you can, where assets have real value, and they're tradable, and you can basically cash them out if you want, in a way. So I can dive into that if we want now.
Yeah, let's go.
Yeah. So real money gameplay, I think this is one of the big ones. I think this is, one of the big differences that people are actually talking about when they talk about marketplaces and trading. This is really where Web3 makes a much larger impact. And so this is the idea that all the assets in a game theoretically could have, if they're on chain, they can have a real money value. And there could be this price discovery via exchanges or whatnot and marketplaces that give you that, how much it's worth. And not all games have that. Obviously, a lot of games have gray markets, but, the lack of liquidity and, the grayness of it and, terms of service, all those things limit, the actual price discovery of these objects. And so, blockchain basically makes it really easy for you to take any object, mint it on chain, and have real money value and create this real money gameplay with their tokens and with currencies where you can have leaderboards, you can have wagering, you can have basically anything within the game that people exchange assets in some way, be either using them, getting reward for them, theoretically could become real money gameplay if that asset could be on chain. So that's a big unlock, I think, that Web3 provides that would be much harder in Web2. Regulations might change and make it super hard in Web3 in the future, but for now, it's way easier to just allow things to be on chain to create this type of gameplay that, might make it a lot more exciting for a lot of people because they have assets that they can own and have real money value. But there's also a lot of risks where, we've seen in the space of people now focusing very much on the money part and less on progressing in the game, less on actually collecting these assets for their intrinsic value. So that's why although I think it's a huge unlock, I have it a bit lower because of those risks and because of those issues that have come up that are actually quite hard to avoid if you don't structure your positioning and your narrative properly around the game.
How do you think about, as a consequence of this, potential financialization or the essentially your ability to just sell whatever asset you have? What do you think are the consequences of giving players essentially the ability to exit a game? Right? In traditional Web2 games, once you own a game or you own game assets, those are a sunk cost because you're stuck with them, and you might be able to sell your account, but that's not really legal.
Yeah.
Once, as a game developer, you commit yourself to building on top of a blockchain or with the blockchain or Web3 enabled, you give players assets. But if you do something and players don't like it, they can now exit. And that's something that you have to keep in mind. So you're essentially making that commitment, which from a player perspective, I'd prefer the ability to exit. Like, I think in reality, I'd be interested to see those dynamics play out, because I do feel like, it's easier said than done, because, NFTs are not very liquid in many cases. And so, the ability to exit, just trying to sell your asset below floor price on OpenSea, and seeing the floor price go down, and like, fuck, I can't get this sold. Like, it's not that simple, right? But my point being, like, as a someone that has worked in game game devs before, how do you think about that?
Yeah, so I think this very much leans towards player value versus developer value. I think as a developer, you almost want more of that friction to keep people in your ecosystem, and you're incentivized to not let them cash out, so they want to keep playing your game. But from a player perspective, it's amazing. Yeah, I totally agree. As a player, you want to be able to cash out, and it even more so makes the developer work harder and be more cognizant and be more persistent in making sure the game is awesome, so that you stick around, not just because of that reason, but because you can cash out. They got to make sure they're putting out new content. They're making sure the game continues to be engaging, and so I think it's a huge win for players as a whole to be able to cash out of games, but yeah, much harder for developers. I think there is potentially some advantage if, because players are able to cash out, they're also willing to spend more initially, and they're also willing to invest more, because they have this safety net almost of like, okay, I can always cash out, so I can go a bit crazy with my spending and getting more assets. So does that outweigh the con of them potentially cashing out? Hard to say. Depends on your game, depends on your situation.
100%. Good. We're already past 40 minutes, and so I wanted to get your guys' take on an observation I made while reading through this list, and it was that it felt to me like the way you're thinking about this, and it is probably the most scientifically correct way to think about this, is you're looking at all of these features that Web3 brings, and then you're looking at essentially gaming today and seeing like, how does this apply, and what benefits and advantages does this bring to the games and types of games I know. And during this conversation that we had until now, we already in a few times touched upon like, oh, they're doing this differently, and this is an interesting approach. But because this is still in such a nascent space, we haven't really seen any of these new approaches used in a fully non-skeuomorphic way, like in a bottoms-up approach versus a Web2 game where we're going to plug this new Web3 tool into it. And so we haven't really seen that get to scale, and so get to true success. And for that reason, I feel like this approach, almost by definition, has as a result that you've never given an A. Your best score is a B+.
Yeah.
And to me, that's not really surprising. And it feels like the games that we will need to see games that use these elements that you mentioned in a new way that wouldn't be possible in the games you're projecting them on now, to get convinced that there's actually more to be done there, engaged there.
Yeah, and I also think a B+ in terms of incremental value that the tech provides, I think can be very substantial. And you think about some of the big shifts in tech, from MySpace to Facebook or things like that. There was new tech that was needed for getting that type of scale and getting that type of behavior, but a lot of it, but that kind of incremental value was able to make a big difference. So I do see that, especially, we didn't talk about it, but UGC is like, if you can make UGC a bit easier and a bit more accessible, I think the impact of that can be very large. And that's maybe not what people want. They want, the one thing that's going to be like the game changer for Web3. That's very clear. Like, this is adding significantly more value. But I don't think there is one. But I think, there's a lot of impact that can be driven even from these things that, make things not necessarily game-changingly better.
Yeah. And I do think it's a really interesting observation, because Web3 to really be meaningful is going to have to manifest itself earlier in the development process, right? I think we've talked about this a number of times where just throwing Web3 aspects into a traditional game and just layering it on top only provides so much value. And I think that's historically where we've seen people just write it off as useless additional tech being added onto things that are already running perfectly fine. I think there's going to be an element of creativity that is going to manifest itself in some of the games, and maybe that's one of the positives. As a biased person here, talking about the Web3 bull run and crypto VC, because a lot of projects with very ambitious and creative visions got the funding they needed to pursue them, and I still think that a vast majority of them are going to fail, but maybe it only takes one to show some of these features that Philip wrote about working for other people and to build on top of it, and for the risk profile of those types of investments of time and cash to really be a viable part of gaming. So I guess maybe the takeaway there is it only takes one person to do it really creatively to prove out the value, and maybe we'll start to see some of these D's and C's turn into B's and B pluses.
Yeah, totally.
Talking about that, Philip, you've graded this looking at the state of how it is and the technology is today. Which of these are you most excited about? Do you feel like has the most potential moving forward for games?
Yeah, I think UGC is probably one of the top of my list. I just see there's a lot of potential to have these systems just managed through blockchain and being able to create incentive systems that give a lot more value to creators, in whether that be in-game assets or tokens or different types of systems to reward them with things that also have real money value, and that they can cash out much more easily and have more deterministic ways to get those payouts. And I think one thing I saw that was interesting was, even Shrapnel, they have, really cool kind of system that they're building out, and even rewarding curators and having an entire system around rewarding people who curate, because, UGC content, there's so much of it. And that's one of the big problems with it is, where are the gems in there? Like, what are the things that you want to surface to the top? And actually rewarding curation, it can be part of this system as well. And all of that would be much harder, I think, to build within Web2 with the existing, cash out systems, and you'd have to hold all this money that people can withdraw into their bank accounts, and with Web3 I think it streamlines a lot of that. So that's where I see some of the biggest impact potentially in the closer term, and then longer term potentially the other one we didn't talk about was social coordination systems. Is I think the way I look at it now, it's not super powerful, but especially as more things potentially happen outside of a game as well, with governance and with different types of contribution programs, there could be a lot more there.
Gotcha. Philip Collins, how about you?
Yeah, I actually think the UGC aspect of what Philip's talking about there is really interesting, because I do find that one of the seemingly most compelling aspects of Web3 in games is being able to directly tie value creation to the delivery of value to that creator. And so that's somewhere where smart contracts in games are extremely compelling. If we just go purely on the smart contract side, we're understanding what you are giving, and even down to the asset level, right? Like, it's not creating full games or experiences, but providing 0.1% of an environment and being rewarded for that accordingly to your contribution. I do think there's a lot of interesting stuff around value exchange. I don't have as much of an opinion on the social coordination, I'd say, but on UGC, I definitely think there's something interesting there, even though that's more of a derivative of successful integrations of UGC, which is an entire another conversation that we could probably spend an hour on.
Mm-hmm. Yes, to add on to the point of UGC, and it's something that's, I would say, no, I didn't really miss in here, but something that not a lot of thought is given to right now, although it's increasing, is the fact that the way we're looking at Web3, or the way most people are looking at Web3 for games right now, is as a digital ledger more than anything else, where it's a way you track ownership, and you have these assets on this ledger, and then you can transfer them. And that's, if you look at all of the different points that the advantages or potential disadvantages that Web3 brings to games, that's where they are derived from. But the thing is that it's actually more than a ledger; it's also a computer, and so you can actually program logic on these. And that's, when you mentioned, Phil, that there's smart contracts, and so you can know that once you contribute something, you'll know that X, like a fraction of any revenue that it generates, comes to you. I think that's really interesting, and I think that's something I'm excited about. But it's so far out there that I don't think anyone has any idea about how this actually works at scale. It is once we start adding more logic of games to that decentralized computer, which is the blockchain. And so I'm talking to like on a spectrum from Web 2.5 games on one end and fully on-chain games on the other end. I'm just curious what we'll see emerge on the weird end, where there's more logic and we're making use of that decentralized computer more than as just a way to transact value and assets.
Yeah, and
here
a
I am,
big advantage
random
of that.
podcast. Sorry, I'm shilling on-chain games again, as I tend to do. Sorry, Phil, I interrupted you. Go ahead.
Oh yeah. No, I was just gonna say, the transparency component I think is big. Especially for creators, like being able to see exactly how the payouts are going out, and with platforms like Roblox or Fortnite, it's all controlled centrally. They figure out how much you get paid out and in what ways and what the rules are around that. But if all of that's on chain and transparent, it hard to say like how much people will care about it over time, but I think it is a value that creators get to have that transparency into the system that actually pays them out.
Mm-hmm. Good. As a final question for you, Philip La, I would like from you two grades. One, global, what Web3 brings to games today, grade.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to have the same grade, but in, let's say, 5 years from now.
So right now, I'd give it on average a C, I would say.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
5 years from now, an A. I'm aiming for that A for 5 years from now. I think, there's so much things being worked on right now. I think, as you said, only takes one, and to really show the value. And I think, a lot of these areas with, onboarding and just the technology needing way more hand-holding to get things done. Like so much of that will improve. Like there's a million people working on wallets right now, just making wallets more seamless to use. So, I think we'll get there.
I feel like C today and an A in 5 years is probably the summary of my whole thinking around this technology for games in general. I don't know if you agree, Phil Collins, but I feel like this is what we've been talking about the whole time, or every time we talk about, or we discuss the concerns that a lot of traditional games people have about blockchain as a technology. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I think I'm roughly around that C range today. I'd maybe go slightly more negative towards like the C minus, but within the same realm as you guys. And I think in the future, if done right and everything plays out as we've historically thought and hoped, my initial reaction was to say like B plus A minus. And honestly, like I don't say that lightly. Like I think a B plus or an A minus overall in 5 years, to Philip's point before, is a lot of value, right? And so I'll stick around there, and that's not necessarily a knock. I'm going to discount for just a little bit of skepticism. So I'll land at the B plus just to try to be a little bit conservative.
Yeah,
I think that's fair. Good, awesome. Philip, where can people learn more? And sorry, when I say Philip now, I mean Philip La. This was confusing. Phil, where can people find you and learn more about you and follow your writings and thoughts?
On Twitter, I'm just at Philip La. on LinkedIn, I am Philip Law. Those are probably the two main places that I write. I have a blog as well, but that's LinkedIn. My Twitter is Substack. So yeah, I just started a new job, so probably won't be writing or posting as much. But yeah, we'll try to get more thoughts out over time for any interesting learnings.
Fantastic, cool. All right, Philip and Philip, awesome to have you, Philip Law. Thanks for taking the time in your morning to join us. Philip Collins, as usual, great thoughts. Always such rational takes, a bit too conservative to my liking from time to time, but I'll accept it. Good. All right, listener, thank you for listening. If you enjoyed, let us know. Join the Discord if you haven't already. Philip is also in there. He's called the Green Ranger. So if you want to tell him he's wrong about his scoring, then come tell him there, and we can have a productive discussion about it. And with that, we are out, and we look forward to speaking to you in the next episode. Ciao.